Richard Katz, editor-in-chief of the Oriental and Economist report, will present his paper discussing the future of the Korean economy to see what can be done to avoid the same stagnant economy of Japan. Mr. Katz is uniquely positioned to discuss this matter because he's been writing about Japan's economy for over 30 years, including authoring 2 books on Japan. Then our own homegrown talent, Troy Stangarone, the Senior Director of Congressional Affairs and Trade at KEI, will discuss President Park Geun-hye's Creative Economy Initiative, which is designed to promote indigenous homegrown innovation to continue Korea's dramatic economic success story. Troy served at KEI for over 8 years. He currently edits KEI flagship publication, Korea's Economy, and the Peninsula blog. Then we're going to have Claude Barfield, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, join us. Claude is also one of KEI's advisory council members and is a distinguished and well-known expert on international trade policy, and once in a while has a few good stories to tell, some of which are true. He has authored many books and received his PhD from Northwestern University, my home state of Illinois. Claude will discuss the economic and strategic stakes involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Then we have 2 discussants for the panel, including Richard Shin, Senior VP at Economist Incorporated, a premier economic consulting firm, and Joshua Meltzer, a fellow in global economy and development at the Brooking Institute and an adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies and at Georgetown Law School. So the order will be, let's first go with Mr. Katz, who will have his power presentation, and then Troy, and Troy, when you finish, then we'll bring everybody up here. Okay? You're up.
Is this the clicker? Okay, good. Yeah.
And all right, someone's got to help me put this thing up.
You just point it forward.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Whoa. All right, here we go. Hi. I'm Rick. I'm a charterholic. And I'm not one of the reforming types. I'm an unreformed charterholic. So I've got, 85 charts here, but I'm told I'm not allowed to use all of them. So I'm just going to go through some of them. But basically, my background is really Japan. And we are, this is, I think, oh man.
Are they out of order?
They are screwed up. Well, especially the most exciting one at the beginning. All right, well, that's really too bad. Okay, I really have this duty of a chart. In 4 years, Korea is going to overtake Japan in per capita GDP. This is a world historical moment. It is the first Asian country that will overtake Japan in per capita GDP of any size. Taiwan has, but that's a much smaller country. It's a gigantic change. And so as I began doing the research on this, I thought, gee, what are the lessons for Japan of what Korea has done? But as I learned, in fact, there's there's lots of things which are different about Korea, which give Korea the chance to avoid what happened to Japan. There is unfortunately too much which is similar, which poses the danger that unless Korea acts, it will become a fallen star like Japan. Now, if you look at the achievement of Korea, the miracle in the Han really is true, but so is Japan's miracle. Right? Look at the last 50 years. Among all the 28 countries that are now rich for which we have data, Korea grew the fastest, almost 6% a year for 50 years. This is remarkable, absolutely remarkable. There are countries that grow quickly for a decade or two, but to do it for 50 years, is extremely unusual. Over the past 20 years, which we've got 48 countries data, again you see Korea head and shoulders, Japan now below. On the previous chart, Japan would have, if you've done something for Japan, say 55 to 90, you would have seen Japan in a similar position. Now, in any country, there are really 3 sources of growth. One is, how many more workers do you have per year and how many hours they're working? So basically, how many more work hours per year? Say it's growing by 2%. And suppose each worker can put out 3% more than the year before. So you get 2 plus 3, that gives you 5. Right? So it's basically the growth in the work and the growth in the productivity per worker. Now, the productivity per worker, in turn, comes from two sources. You give each worker more tools, they can work better. You give someone a tractor, they can do more than with a plow. Give them a plow, they can do more than with nothing. Right? But also, when you go from a change from the plow to the tractor, that's technology. So part of it's giving people more tools, but the second one is giving them better tools, technology. And that first part is called capital investment, and the second part is called total factor productivity, which means not only the output per worker, but the output per worker plus the tools combined. And Korea is losing the first two, labor and the investment. Now, as a result, Korea's growth rate is going to drop. Now, that in itself is not a problem. This is the optimistic view from the Korean Development Agency, which says its potential growth will be close to 4% in the next decade, then 3% in the decade of 2020s, and then 2% in the decade of 2030s. Well, you know what? Given the drop in the Korean population, that's a per capita growth of about 2.5% of GDP per year. That's a good outcome for a country that's as rich as Korea will be at that time. That will be above average. But there's a real big and so that slowdown is a natural product of maturation. It's not a problem. The problem is that Korea slows down much, much more than it should, as Japan did, if it undergoes its own lost decades. And the IMF, for example, sees a much slower slowdown, much quicker. It's only 2.4% by 2020. And remember, the Korean Development Institute, the government agency, say 3%. And by 2025, 2%. 15 years ahead of what the Korean government says. And this also may turn out to be too optimistic of you, if Korea does not avoid the dangers. So let's see. One reason why Korea grew so fast is because not only did there were more workers per population, but they were working incredible hours. At a peak in 1985, the average Korean worker was working 2,800 hours a year. This compared to Japan, which is about 2,200, the U.S., which is about 1,700, and the U.S. is more typical of a rich country. Now it's come down. If you look, does this have a laser on it? Okay.
I think it's the center button.
You think so? There we go. Oh, bada bing. Okay, there you go. So you see, it hit this peak, or maybe it did not. There you go. It sort of hit this peak, right? And now it's really dropping rapidly. So as the Korean people have become more affluent, they're not only getting more material goods, but they're buying leisure time. That's a good thing. But it means that source of growth is disappearing, and actually the number of workers in Korea is going to turn negative in a few years. Right? So labor force will actually drop. So remember we said two things: how much more work, how many work hours per year, and the productivity of each worker. They're going to lose the work hours. Now, on the capital investment side, Korea invests in a huge amount, 30 to 40% a year. That's very, very high. It's one of the highest levels of any rich country. Which means, out of every dollar GDP you're producing a year, you're taking 40% and you're investing it, which means you have less to consume. That's okay if you're getting the growth from it, because it means you don't consume it today, but you get to consume it in 5 years or 10 years. But as we see from the black line, they're investing almost as much as ever, but they're getting less and less and less growth for that investment, which means that the productivity of capital is way too low. And that is called diminishing returns in economics, and unless you deal with that, you're going to be in trouble, and that's what Japan did not deal with. So if we compare countries, in Taiwan, we ask how many dollars of capital stock, by which we mean factories, bridges, offices, stores, infrastructure, electricity, housing, machinery, etc. How many dollars of capital do you need to produce $1 of GDP? In Taiwan, it's $2.80. USA, $3.10. The average among the rich OECD countries, $3.80. In Korea, $4.20 is taking more and more every year. And in Japan, it's $4.80. This is not good. This is where you want more output with less input. They're having the opposite problem. Too much inputs to get the same output. So the key to growth in the long term is total factor productivity. All right, someone's going to give me a 5-minute warning, okay? All right, great. So this is sort of, there's a norm, and Korea is below the norm. So it's not producing the amount of output it should get for the amount of labor and capital it puts in. That's the problem. What's the cause of it? That there's two South Koreas. You think there's two Koreas, North and South. Within the South, there's two South Koreas. There's the Korea of the chaebol, these giant conglomerates. This is unbelievable. 30 chaebol produce 36% of all corporate sales in Japan. Two firms, not the entire Samsung chaebol, but just Samsung Electronics. And not the entire Hyundai chaebol, just Hyundai Motors. Those two companies account for a quarter of all of Korean exports. That's putting an awful lot of eggs in just two baskets. And as Finland learned from Nokia, that's a pretty risky strategy. But these chaebol account for 10% of the workforce in Korea. Almost 90% of the Korean people who work for the dark side of the dual economy. They're small and medium enterprises, whether it's services or manufacturing. And they're low wage and they're low productivity. Low productivity means they don't produce as much as they should. Low wage means you get very anemic consumer demand. Because the chaebol are building more and more stuff outside Korea and employing more and more people outside Korea and reducing their employees inside Korea. And if you look, for example, at services, which is going to be the growth area of the economy, as a mature economy, it's a trend line here. That line shows the productivity, basically, what's the share of services in your total employment? It's the horizontal line. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with this machine here, right? That's the share of employment, and this is the share of GDP. That should be a 45-degree angle. They should be equal. You see, Korea is way, way, way below. Now, services can be very productive. In fact, in the U.S., about 30% of the jobs and services are very high-skilled occupations. It could be software programmers, all kinds of stuff. But in Korea, services tend to be these mom-and-pop shops that are at your corner store that people get after they retire or because they can't get a job in manufacturing. And Korea has been fetishizing manufacturing as if all value comes from manufacturing. There's something good about manufacturing and bad about services. Well, let me ask you, what's more important, the DVD or the music that's on the DVD or the movie? Right? Where's the real money? Is the money in all the plastic and material that went into the iPod, or what the iPod can do? Software, services. This is where a modern economy makes its money. The wages in the small medium enterprises are falling, which means consumer demand's a problem. The wages in services, compared to other countries, the black line's Korea, again, falling relative to manufacturing, way, way below international trends. Which means not only from the output side, what Korea can produce is slowing down, but Korea's ability to give its workers the income to buy what they themselves produce is also slowing down. This is exactly like Japan. The wages are below the global standard. I'm not going to go through the details. Now, so Korea's this fantastically stellar country that's getting itself into a mess. So what are the advantages that Korea has? Well, one is the Korean leaders are talking about the fact that they're in trouble. Unlike the Japanese leaders who in the 1990s would say, we're not in trouble, it's just a little rough spot. So that itself is really, really good. And also, the Koreans have the Japanese experience to learn from. The Japanese did not have the Japanese experience to learn from. All right? So they recognize the need for reform. Can they do the reform? Do they know the reforms that are needed? And can they summon the political power to actually achieve it? I don't know. Most of the commentaries are kind of skeptical, but I'm not a Korea expert, so I can't judge. But at least they're saying we got to solve the problem. And as they say in Chartaholics Anonymous, the first step toward a solution is recognizing that you made too many charts. Right? Korea is also much more globalized than Japan. And history has shown that not only do countries that have more trade and more foreign direct investment grow faster, but they're able to reform more easily when they get into trouble, because this breaks down the power of the local vested interests which want to stop reform. And so the more trade, the more inward FDI, the right type, the more your ability to reform. You look at China, you look at Poland, you look at India, look at Korea itself, it's across the country. And finally, a political system where political parties have alternated in power. And when you want to make a course correction, you need competition in politics just as you need competition in business. Now, a few more charts. One is, all right, I did it here, forget, I'm not going to explain that chart. But it really shows, if Korea had trade as low as Japan's, it would be so much worse off than it is. And if Japan had as much trade in FDI as Korea did, it would be so much better off than it is. But let's look at this one. This is the ratio of trade to GDP, all right? So we looked 50 years ago, and Korea, Japan, and the OECD, the rich OECD countries, are basically all the same. But look since then. Japan went from 20% up to 30%. It was meandering, it was strolling, it was ambling, it was hardly moving at all. When the OECD went to almost 60, and Korea went to 110% of GDP, if someone wants to know why trade can be more than 100%, I'll tell you later, but trust me, you can. The point is, well, Japan was walking, Korea was running. I'm not going to do that. One question we want to look at is how much of that trade really competes with domestic goods. What trade improves productivity through a lot of means, partly because you specialize in what you do best. But the other thing is the competition for being in the global market gives your companies a kick in the pants that makes them be productive. On the export side, the first Toyotas that Toyota tried to sell were junk, and they sold like junk. The first Hyundais that Korea tried to sell were lousy, and they sold lousy, but they learned to make them better. But the same thing is true on the import side. Now the problem right now is only 10% of Koreans' imports are consumer goods that compete with Korean goods. A lot of them are inputs to Koreans' own exports. The good news on this front, you look at the ratio of imported cars to total cars in Japan. It's done nothing. It's been flat about 7 or 8% for the last 20 years. 15 years, I got figures here. You look at Korea, the black line. That's going higher and higher and higher. And these the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement, the Korea-Europe Free Trade Agreement, these other things, really good sign. Now, when Kim Dae-jung came to power, he said, you know what? Foreign direct investment by foreign companies is not only important to Korea's economy, it's important to Korean democracy. Because he felt that Chaebol were part of the military-industrial complex, the Park Chung-hee dictatorship, right, the father of the current president. And so he said, we're going to kill two birds with one stone by bringing in foreign direct investment, modernization economically, democratization politically. And so Korean FDI leaped. It was 2%, and now it went up to 11%, now 13%. Japan went up a bit, but again, Japan was walking while Korea was racing. Oh, they lost that chart too. Okay. The bad news is that the growth in Korea foreign direct investment has basically stalled out. And Chaebol don't like it so much except when it helps them. So there's a real question. The role of Chaebol was a big issue in the Korean last elections. So here's to sum up, and I think I'm under my 5 minutes here, right, is that Korea really, really does face the danger of becoming a falling star like Japan. The problem is, when you're so successful, it's really, really hard, even no matter what words you say, it's really, really hard to recognize that what you've been doing is wrong. And you're going to be falling down in about 2 days, like IBM did, like GM did. So that's really, really hard. They've got the time to make the changes, if they make them. But that means they also have the time to avoid making changes if you're a politician who wants to get elected and you don't want to do something unpopular. So they need reform. The leaders are talking about reform. Can they do it? Will they do it? I don't know. We'll meet again in 10 years and we'll see what happens. All right, thank you very much.
You did excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. And yes, I'm here to talk about the change aspect of all of this. The good news for Korea, to talk about it from a political standpoint, just to sort of tie in where Rick left off, is that with a one-term president, re-election isn't an option, so you can take and try to push through political change. So, as I'm sure many of you have heard, President Park Geun-hye's economic policy is the creative economy. And so I'm going to sort of look at where Korea is as an innovation nation, and sort of what kind of steps they're looking to take and what kind of steps need to happen going forward. So how does Korea rank on innovation? Well, according to Bloomberg and their list of 30 most innovative countries, Korea is the most innovative country in the world. The Global Innovation Index, which is put out by INSEAD, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and one other group I'm forgetting at the moment, ranks them as the 19th most innovative country in the world. The World Economic Forum lists them as 17th. In terms of tax incentives for research and development, Korea has the 5th highest amount in the world. They have the highest amount of business enterprise R&D as a percentage of their gross domestic product. They are the number 3 business R&D expenditure country in the world after Israel and Japan. And if you look at royalties from patents, they're growing at about 12.3% a year, which is higher than the OECD average, which is 10.1%. So if we look at all of this, on the surface it would say that Korea is a highly innovative nation. If we take and sort of intuitively look at Korea, what are some of the things we think of? Well, we've talked about Samsung Electronics. I have the Samsung Note 2. I guess I just gave an ad as well.
And the Motorola.
But, so when we think about consumer electronics products, Samsung is one of the top countries in the world, or companies in the world. You have LG as well. If any of you read the New York Times and Thomas Friedman's column, I think every couple of years he talks about taking a train ride in Korea and being amazed how, if you go through mountains, you'll still have cell service and you'll have internet service, to where if you go through a tunnel on a subway system in the United States, you'll lose all your service. So, the general image is that Korea is a high-tech, innovative country. So, if we're talking about innovation, how does Korea sort of compare with the United States? Well, if we look at research, development, and expenditure, and I put this in a pie chart form, they look pretty much the same. Business R&D is roughly the same. If you look at it, there is about the same expenditure by the government. In terms of higher education, we see that there's a difference there. It's about 5% or so. And then one other interesting difference is that in the United States you have a much greater percentage of nonprofit contributions to R&D. And I don't know if any of you saw this, I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago. There was actually a big article in the New York Times about the impact of nonprofits. So, in some ways this is like the Gates Foundation, putting research into, better and cheaper drugs and things of that nature. And how there's a lot of positive benefits from this, but that there are also maybe potential downsides. But it's an interesting difference, I think, between the United States and Korea in terms of R&D expenditure. Now, if we look at sort of what type of research and development Korea and the United States are doing, these charts are virtually identical. If you were to look at the numbers, in some cases it's tenths of a percentage points difference in terms of how much of the R&D is done in experimental development, how much is applied research, and how much is basic research. So to a large extent, the research and development profile in a general over-the-top view is very similar between the two countries. So why has Park Geun-hye come out and said that Korea needs a creative economy? And this is sort of a long quote, and I only have 2 quotes in here. But I think it sort of helps to take and sort of draw it out. And the essence of this quote is that essentially in terms of per capita income, Korea hasn't grown in the last 7 years. And that in order to transcend this limit, as she says, Korea needs to change the paradigm of its economic growth. And for her, that means to create a creative economy. And, in essence, what she's saying is that we're living in an age of creativity and imagination, and it's time that Korea moves in this direction. Now, the challenge since President Park has come to office has been that a lot of people have asked the sort of question, what is a creative economy? And part of the reason for that is that she's essentially using a term that already existed in a new way. And what I mean by that is that, and there's the picture here is from the London Korean Film Festival, and I picked that consciously because the UK was sort of the first country to push a creative agenda. But what it meant essentially was, potentially high-earning individuals in creative industries, and by that they meant things like film. They meant, the other arts, so music and things of that nature. So it was very much sort of focused on cultural types of issues and creative issues. But what I think President Park is really saying isn't necessarily that Korea is going to try and focus, and while culture is part of that, on a cultural-based change to its economy. What she's talking about is taking and transforming the nature of the economy in general to one to where all industries are much more creative. And so I think some of the confusion has come from this usage of prior term, both in the UK, in Australia, and in one other country which escapes me at the moment. So if we look at Korea, we saw these charts. Korea is, according to Bloomberg, the most innovative country in the world. So what types of challenges then does Korea face that might be spurring, this push towards a creative economy? Well, one, as Rick talked about, not only do you have slowing growth, but you have slowing growth potential in Korea. You have demographic decline. During President Park's administration, the projection is that the Korean workforce will actually begin to start declining. So the population as a whole won't, but the size of the actual workforce will. You have high levels of household debt, over 100% of GDP. The chaebol, while Samsung, Hyundai, and others are very successful and they're expanding abroad, as they do that, they're doing more production and more work abroad, and they're contributing less to job creation within Korea itself. Korea is also reaching the limits of its export-oriented growth model. How much more can Korea export, and how much more can it produce domestically, in terms of cars and cell phones and things, and keep moving forward? Another way to look at this is sort of, if you look at the Korean economy, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, a lot of these companies all developed, in the aftermath of the Korean War, and came to sort of a rise in the 80s, early 90s, and really became global players, probably early 2000s. But we haven't seen, a new company sort of emerge, a Google or an Amazon, companies who are fairly recent to the U.S. economy. So we haven't had that shift in the Korean economy either. Oops. So, sorry. So if we look, though, at the question of innovation a little deeper, what can we say about Korea? I mean, we've heard sort of the praise, but what are perhaps the downsides, and why? Because if Korea is the most innovative country in the world, there wouldn't be a need for a creative economy. So the question then is, why is Park Geun-hye really pushing this? Well, if you look at a different list of rankings of innovation, there are no Korean companies on the Forbes 100 most innovative companies list. I was actually really surprised at it, and when I first saw it, I looked through the list multiple times, because it seems counterintuitive that Samsung wouldn't be on that list out of all the companies, but there isn't one. In terms of tridactic patents, which means patents that are applied for in the United States, Europe, and Japan, Korea is only at literally the OECD average. In terms of trademarks, it's below average. Now, some of this is reflective of the shape of Korea's economy, which is primarily manufacturing, and services contribute less to the Korean economy than in most developed economies. And so countries like the United States that tend to be services heavy have many more trademarks relative to patents, but you're still seeing Korea essentially either only perform at average rate or underperform. So you have a problem there in terms of its patents and its trademarks. When you look at knowledge-intensive services, which would seem to imply, given what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, sort of the direction that Korea wants to go in terms of innovation, it trails countries such as Russia and Brazil, which I found somewhat surprising. And then the question is Korea getting enough value out of its research? If we look at statistics, Korea is investing either on a per capita basis or in some cases an absolute basis as much or more than any country in the world. But you're not seeing these results in terms of patent numbers, in terms of even though royalties are growing, it's still not one of the top royalty countries in the world. So is Korea getting as much out of this as possible? And one way to look at this is It's the Electronics and Telecommunications Research Institute in Seoul. And there is a U.S. publication which ranks innovation in terms of patents per year. And for the 3 years they've been doing the survey, ETRI has been number one. It's beating Stanford, it's beating MIT, it's beating everyone. But in terms of the effectiveness of their patents, it's only half that of MIT. So you're seeing perhaps this increase in patents, but just the value of that research is not really coming through. Korea also, in terms of international exposure measures in innovation, fares poorly. So in terms of scientific cooperation, if you go to the OECD has a very interesting little chart to where essentially it's a line graph with where each country in terms of the amount of international cooperation is a larger bubble, and then where you are in terms of the node internationally, meaning how many countries you collaborate with, is how central you are. Korea is a slightly larger than small node, but it's on the outskirts. It's not a central player. And then if you look at things like international R&D, a lot of R&D in the United States is funded from abroad and in other countries. Israel is the most obvious example where something like 50% of its R&D is funded from abroad. In the case of Korea, it's less than 1%. I mean, it's essentially a rounding error, if even that. So, what is the concept behind the creative economy? Well, the idea that's been put forward is to essentially create a convergence between information, communication, telecommunications technology, and culture with traditional industries. So, two examples that have been sort of put forward more prominently over the last year are things like the healthcare industry. So doing telemedicine to where doctors will be able to take and diagnose patients in remote areas or in cases of crises remotely. So trying to take an advance and merge the healthcare industry with the telecommunications industry. You also have in the energy industry pushing into not only technologies that would take and reduce energy consumption, but in terms of transmission, so things like smart grids. So we're talking about moving into combining of traditional utility delivery or services with modern day communications technology. So how do we get there? Well, a Nobel Prize nominee this past year, Paul Romer, said, "The first step to fulfill the creative economy is to create the right condition for innovative firms that can immediately replace Samsung Electronics when it's faltering." I would actually disagree with him on that, in that the sense is the real goal of the creative economy is to create firms that can flourish alongside Samsung Electronics regardless of whether it's successful or unsuccessful at any moment in time. So what are some areas that need to be considered for the creative economy? Well, Korea lacks venture capitalism, so you need to take and develop a venture capital industry. Entrepreneurism is relatively looked down upon in Korea. Most parents would prefer that their child go get a nice high-paying salary job at Samsung, Hyundai, or somewhere, rather than take the risks of entrepreneurism. So in its essence, Korea is a risk-averse society. Clearly, there potentially needs to be some work on R&D, either in terms of looking at new areas of research or how to take and improve the actual impact of the research afterwards. Some of that may come in, we can do this in Q&A, in marketing and things of that nature, which there's one Samsung product that sort of falls into that category. University research is something that there'll need to be a shift more towards. So, and this will fall into the categories of things like basic research. And then there's a role for trade policy in the sense that, as Korea becomes a more knowledge-intense country, and especially has many Korean firms will remain export-oriented firms, there will be a need to take and ensure that the intellectual property of these firms is protected as it goes abroad, so that way there's new markets for Korean service firms and manufacturers to move into. So, what has the Park administration either put forward its plan or taken and begun to implement? And so this is a combination of some of the different things. One is to create the Biz Cool School initiative, which would take, and by 2017, try to take and promote entrepreneurship to people in elementary, middle, and high school, to take and increase university entrepreneurship training to 40 universities. as opposed to the current, I think it's 20 at the moment. And then to create regional creative economy centers to where entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and prior entrepreneurs can come together to share ideas, to learn more about programs that are available to support entrepreneurs and to help promote startups. In terms of creating venture capital, the idea right now, most businesses are funded from a securities-based system, which means that essentially if you fail, you have to pay off all of your debts, and that precludes being able to start over. So to move more towards the venture capital system, one of the things that needs to be done to create incentives for venture capital is regulatory reforms for mergers and acquisitions. So there's a way for venture capital firms to take and reap the profits and the benefits of their investment. Tax incentives for angel investors for startups. Incentives for Koreans abroad to take and invest or create startups within Korea. And then essentially to create a venture capital fund, and what they're looking at right now is the Uzuma Fund, which was one that was started in Israel with the idea of taking and providing a platform for companies to take and essentially list themselves on foreign stock exchanges and to attract foreign capital. And the Uzuma Fund was actually based on sort of the model of Silicon Valley, so in essence, a Silicon Valley style fund. And then also one of the goals is to increase R&D to 5% of GDP by 2017. Though this is something that I think you can tell from my earlier comments, it perhaps needs to be viewed in a more systemic manner in terms of how that extra money is utilized. Also, to address some of the international issue, Korea is looking to attract 300 of the top 1% of scientists in the world. And one of the ways they're looking to do this is they're creating what's called the Korea Research Fellowship, which from what I read sounds fairly generous. They'll pay for your travel, your cost of research, and pretty much anything else you need. So it seems like it's a pretty full, all-encompassing package. Then in terms of intellectual property, they're looking to take and increase IP enforcement, provide help to Korean SMEs abroad in enforcing their IP, expand the patent box to mid-sized firms, which is essentially a tax scheme to get companies to share some of their innovations by creating tax incentives for sharing technology, and then to establish a creative fund for joint public and private commercialization of new technologies. So, what are the challenges to wrap up of sort of transitioning Korea to a creative economy? I mean, we've talked about the need for entrepreneurship, venture capitalism, and some other things. But ultimately, innovation is about more than creativity. It's about creating an environment to where you can see opportunities and you can realize them. And part of that means, even though Korea is focusing on ICT to begin with, it's about expanding it beyond simply the ICT sector. And if we think about expanding the conception of innovation, much of what Korea has focused on in the past has been either process or applied innovation, which means how things are produced and incremental improvements on things. Korea really needs to focus more on basic research, the type of innovation that can cause disruption within markets and create new markets to take and really sort of expand forward. And the Atlantic Monthly had an article on the 50 greatest inventions since the invention of the wheel. It came out in, I think, like December. And the one thing that's interesting about it is you look through, some of them are sort of self-evident. The number one invention since the wheel is the printing press, perhaps the most disruptive invention in human history. But the smartphone isn't on there, and everyone sort of looks to Steve Jobs as this great innovator. And I'd actually argue that Steve Jobs is perhaps maybe the greatest marketer of the 20th and 21st century. A lot of the things that are innovations are the basic sort of technologies that then everything is built off of. And the smartphone is one of those types of things. But beyond sort of expanding this conception of innovation, Korea needs to take and provide long-term support for this transition. I talked early on, I started off by saying the advantage of a one-term presidency is that you don't have to face re-election. If you believe in economic reform, you can push that through. The downside of a one-term presidency is that there will be a next president in now about 3.5 years. And for Lee Bok, green growth was the great sort of economic plan and the great push of Korea. Korea still does green growth, but it's not the same focus or emphasis. And now one could argue that green growth is a much narrow field, But if Korea is looking to take and transition to an innovation economy, there will need to be long-term political support over a series of presidencies to take and fulfill the transition. Thank you.
Claude, you want to have a seat? The rest of the panelists have a seat with Claude.
We do have. Richard does have the one last PowerPoint. So.
Well, Claude, you're up. And then just
Yep.
flip it by ear and other. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. When Troy asked me to do this paper, he referred to a talk that I'd given at the Asan Institute, I guess a year or so ago, in which I talked about the interconnection of trade policy inevitably with foreign policy and security policy. And basically what I tried to do in this paper was to take the experience of the United States on the one hand and Korea on the other in terms of the motivations, the actions they had taken about trade policy. And basically, I guess I would argue that, though we didn't plan it, the president's trip is a good kickoff for me in the sense that Mr. Obama is going to Asia for a variety of reasons. Certainly, it is from a foreign policy security aspect to reinforce or try to buck up what is perceived, I think, in Asia as a declining pressure from the United States to have to continue a pivot. But he is also going for economic reasons, and I think while they will not get you won't wrap up everything in the on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, he wants to further that. So if you look at that trip, it basically shows the combination that inevitably comes at the presidential level of trade on the one hand and economics and security on the other. And the point I make in my paper is that, and as a matter of fact, I will amend it now. I made the point in the paper that this is inevitable, whether we're talking about the United States or Korea, Europeans or whatever. When you get beyond the multilateral negotiations of the GATT or the WTO, inevitably other factors come into play when a president or a prime minister, a head of state in another country decides on a particular partner you will have, what will be in that agreement, and the placement of a trade agreement within a nation's larger foreign policy and security strategy. And I think that is inevitable. I wrote that in the paper, and then I thought, that's not really true in the sense that I certainly am old enough, though some of you in this room certainly are not, to remember that in the 70s and 80s, a great complaint in the United States was, well, we only had the GATT and then the WTO, that foreign policy considerations trumped. I think that wasn't true often, but the people who thought they were getting a bad deal by trade said, well, what the president has done, what Mr. Reagan has done, or Mr. Jimmy Carter has done, is he's gone for a foreign policy goal as opposed to an economic goal. And that was argued about the GATT and the United States' position in the GATT. So it was not even entirely true then, but it's certainly true, I think now, or with any country, just the United States, and that is when you look indeed, and I won't go any farther than this, and I'll go into the paper. When you look at how things come to the White House or the Blue House, yes, you have the trade minister when you're deciding whether or not you'll have a bilateral with China and Korea's case, or the United States with TPP, or bilaterals with Korea, whoever. But sitting at the table is not just the trade minister, who is often not nearly the most important person at the table, but someone from state, from somebody in defense, from somebody in the Commerce Department representing industry, somebody from the environmental groups. And so the decision has to be filtered up through a number of competing interests that are not just, some of them are economic, but not the same economic interests as the trade minister. And you often do, it's not and just to narrow it to security and trade, you really have two very different universes, very different constituencies, and they're not always in conflict, but you can have really different priorities, and you can have the trade side or the economic / domestic politics side get in the way of what a president would count as the security goals of the United States. For instance, just to take, the U.S. FTA with Colombia, which was negotiated in 2007, and then also with that the trade agreement with Korea. two important allies of the United States who were surrounded by environments that were not friendly either to them or to us. And yet it took almost 4 years to get that through the Congress, because the imperatives of foreign policy and security could not match the domestic politics. And there's been that kind of back and forth all through the last 20 years. The last 20 years, as the United States has moved more toward bilateral and regional agreements as a supplement to the multilateral system. In the time I've got, I'm not going to go through. What I do in the paper is to take first the United States and then Korea and kind of walk through the last 20 years in terms of how individual administrations have faced this. And I start on the United States side really with the first George Bush administration and with Secretary of State Baker, who really, in a combination of things, and by the way, just as a footnote, I have this in the paper, to the consternation really of the trade representative, Carla Hills at the time, who was an excellent trade representative, and her senior partner in the USTR, Jules Katz, who were convinced, committed multilateralists, and they thought moving away from the multilateral system really was a betrayal of trade system of our trade principles. Baker said no. There are other ways to get to the same thing. On the economic side, bilateral agreements or regional agreements might be equally good if we can't get what we want multilaterally. But the other thing that Baker saw, whether he was talking about whether it was backing the NAFTA or whether it was the putative plans for a free trade of the Americas, was that there were large security and political payoffs from broadening the tools of trade policy. And in the paper, I go through the administration, and it was also just in terms of this particular audience. It was Baker who made in 1990 or 91, I forget which it is, in response to Prime Minister Mahathir's call from Malaysia for an East Asian caucus, the famous statement that the United States will not sit still to have a line drawn down the middle of the Pacific with us on one side of it and the nations of Asia on the other. Now, Baker made the point in his memoirs later that while there was no security problem coming, this was a political statement as well as an economic statement. And he saw this combination. And I think we see that all the way, from then on. And I go through a little bit about the Clinton administration. The unipolar moment, there wasn't a lot of security problems either in Asia or other places at the time. And then just a footnote before I reached Obama to the Bush administration, Bush II administration, and only to say that it's with the Bush II administration, George W. Bush, that you get I think the fullest actually public documents that really say that the United States, in choosing trade partners, will not only look at, which we will look at first, the economic benefits to the United States, but also to the degree to which the countries that we're doing the trade agreement with are following U.S. U.S. security policy, or following U.S. Foreign policy goals, or more broadly, or in a democratic tradition. The Bush administration actually laid this out in documents. And it's not coincidental that the first trade representative under Bush was Robert Zellick, who was an acolyte of James Baker. Zellick, unlike most trade representatives, did not see trade just in isolation. He saw it as a part of a broader picture. Now, just quickly on the Obama administration, and then I'll move to Korea. The Obama administration, in terms of trade policy, if there was one thing they wanted to show the world, that they were different in trade policy, they were different in security policy. And so you really started out with a conscious effort to do that. And yet I think when you look at the way trade policy evolved, their reactions have been very much the same as you found with the Bush administration and with the Clinton earlier administrations. And that is, to be fair to Mr. Obama, he came to office with the greatest financial crisis we'd had since the 30s. He had a divided party on trade issues. So trade policy was not something they wanted to deal with, and they didn't really deal with it very much in the first year. But what they found increasingly, and I'll just take Asia as an example, was that foreign policy and security considerations coming over the transom. It was there, I think you guys probably talked about this, a lot of stuff you talked about this morning, I'm sure this afternoon, that the North Koreans began lobbing the short-range missiles. They came into office not at the very beginning, but as you really begin to see the full effects of a hardening of foreign policy in Asia by the Chinese. And so there was a great deal of shift there. And then independently, as a part of what they wanted to, I would say it was not just PR. It was a conscious attempt. Was that they wanted to show a shift in terms of the so-called pivot to Asia, led by the way, Secretary of State Clinton, not by the Trade Ministry. The trade representative for the first 4 years of the Obama administration was a non-entity. It was not looked to, and it's significant. This is not the first person to do it, first president to do it, but President Obama turned over really the strategic part of trade policy to the National Security Council. And that's really where you had that going. And so it was really, I think, in terms of explaining the turnaround, in terms of pushing the cores finally, in terms of pushing actually the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which they had inherited from the Bush administration, I think it was more foreign policy than economic considerations. It's true, it got linked up a little bit later with the president's desire to double U.S. exports. But I think it really, when you look back at it, when we see, and I don't claim any of the internals on this, it will be the White House discussions. It will be the foreign policy and security changes in Asia rather than the economic changes that were important. Now they both are important, and then to come back finally on the U.S. side, the TPP really became the symbol, actually, increasingly of the pivot, but not only because of the reaction in Asia, but also because of the way the United States sold it. I mean, the other point is that, without getting into detail, maybe you've talked about this earlier, I didn't hear all the sessions, that yes, the president said we would have 60% of our naval forces, our forces in general, in Asia. And yes, we had the 2,500 Marines perched on the west coast of Australia. But that was small potatoes in terms, I think, of the symbol of the TPP. And it continues to be so. It was also true that other nations, and this becomes quite important today, and quite important as a part of the president's current trip, we're seeing that because of budgetary exigencies in the United States, the 60% would be 60% of a smaller defense force. And so the combination was I think, the key, and that is the key. Now, I'm going to spend the next, I don't know how much time I've got here.
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes. On the Korean side, a very different country, obviously. Here, the United States, a world leading economic and political power. Korea, a middle level power that is surrounded by a country that has subjugated it for part of the 20th century and a rising power in China. And so while the particular calculations were different, I think the same combination, and what I go through in the paper is the same combination of economics and political and security you can walk through. And I'm not going to, because of the time, I'm not going to go in detail about the earlier points. My point was particularly about the decision on the chorus. The President No, it certainly was a surprising decision, I think, probably to the Koreans and certainly for the United States. That, I mean, here was a president who came into office as, if not anti-capitalist, at least anti-travel. There were difficult relations with the United States, and yet it was President No who came forward and pushed forward, backed by large economic forces in Korea, with the chorus. And I think part of that decision was the fact that I don't claim to be an expert as much on the Korea politics as on U.S. politics, but the reading that I've done was that the corporations, the chaebol, the others who were pushing this were worried that the fraying of the economic security ties was going to ultimately have an impact on the economics. And so they were pushing to have a chorus, and this overled, as some of you who follow Korean trade policy, there had been a step-by-step plan in Korea to go from smaller economies up to slightly larger economies, to not to go for sensitive sectors at first. The decision, of course, just overleaped that. And a plan that had been put forward in 2003 was suddenly scrapped, and you went right to the United States. I would argue, just jumping forward in my last minutes today, that it's the same combination, though different permutations maybe, or different weightings, that explains the decision of President Park to make the attempt to get into the TPP last year. I remember talking with Taeho Park, the then trade minister, a year and a half ago, who made the point to me that, we've got chorus, that's our kind of sheet anchor there in terms of the economics. There's not a lot new for us in terms of the economic payoff to go beyond that in the TPP. And secondly, we have, in the paper I go over this, we have now an increasingly large investment in China, and our next step has got to be to protect that. And so our next step will be a bilateral with China, and then if we can get it, a trilateral with China, Japan, and Korea, though he at the time was not very, very optimistic about that. I think the reason that President Park turned around really, again, is a combination of economics. That's true. Because the entrance of Japan to the TPP, I'm assuming for the moment it may not happen that this will succeed, the TPP, but the entrance of Japan into the TPP, and then if you were to add Korea, the numbers that the economists, the economic modeling changed quite a bit there. So those of you who know the work of Peter Petrie and others, the payoff now for the TPP for Korea is larger than it was in the earlier modeling, and it actually is much larger than either I think it's about the same as the China-Korea FTA, but larger than the competing regional agreement, the so-called RCEP. So there is an economic change there. But the other thing was the increasingly fraught situation in Asia itself, with China and also with the new North Korean regime. And the sense probably, I think, in her mind was it is better to hook on to this regional agreement because ultimately it will be a means of keeping the United States in Asia. I'll leave it there.
Richard, did you have some?
I could do it without the slides. I think it's much better that way.
Pardon?
I could do it without the slides.
That's fine. Go ahead, you're
fine. Okay, so let me just start the clock here so I won't go over. All right, I'll always go over. All right, so I'm here to discuss 3 papers, and I'm going to obviously have very little time for each paper. But, this is really to talk about future shape of Korea's economy, and 3 papers really deal with that. Rick's paper is really saying, look, Korea has done fantastically well. But looking back at Japan, Korea could head the same way. And so what is it that Korea can do to avoid the same kind of pitfalls that Japan had fallen into for the last decade, or now almost 22 decades? Yeah. And the Choi's paper is basically saying, hey, wait a minute, Korea really needs to transform at this point. Korea has come to a point where the manufacturing and everything is great, but now the creative economy and the innovation is where it's at, and that's where Korea has to make this transition to remain on this high growth path, and to also create more jobs and in the economy. Now, Claude's paper is really talking about the trade policy of Korea and where it should be headed. Now he's given an overview of United States trade, foreign policy, security policy, and has basically made the point that the shift has occurred. That is, that the security aspect may have been more important, the foreign policy may have been more important in the past, and I think he's made this in other papers as well. And economics was a secondary, but now over time, that economics has become a much more important component of it. And in fact, maybe, and I don't think he's drawn this conclusion, but economics might be the driving force in the end. And the key part of that is that economics is really kind of a balance on the security issue as well. Because the more economic trades, more economic ties you have, the more security that you want. And so you got the counterbalancing of these kinds of North Korea, possible Chinese trying to take control in Asia. Those kind of things could be mitigated by having more trade and having more trading partners. So let me just go specifically to each paper. Now, Rick provided a bunch of similarities between Korea and Japan, and he offered 4 differences, and that was kind of the hope for Korea. One was that Korean leaders already know about this and they are talking about it. He's not sure whether the Korean leaders have the political willpower to follow through on it. And that Korea is far more globalized, therefore that there's going to be more chance of reform, and that Korea has a power change, has experience with power change. in his paper, he's also talking about this labor and capital and the total factor productivity. Now, in economics, you talked about labor productivity and you got capital, and everything else is added to keep coming with a total factor productivity. So he's kind of attributed that other thing as technology. But I think one thing that he might want to think about is that there is labor productivity not only due to the number of hours that's been worked, or number of days that people have, or number of workers you have, but it's also the level of education and the skill set that matters. And this is, Romer, I think one of the economists has talked about education as one of the inputs into productivity, and that will be a part of the total factor productivity, not just the technological change. And so if you take that into consideration, I don't know how his equation might change. He also mentioned the fact that Korea has a very low rate of return on capital investment in terms of growth. And so there is a little bit of concern here from my end because, in economics, if you have you're making capital investment and you're not getting the return from it, then obviously that capital would be invested somewhere else. It doesn't have to be in Korea. Capital is relatively freely moving these days. And therefore the question becomes, what is it that's failing at this point that's creating these kinds of country-specific differences in rate of return for your capital investment? And so that's something that he might want to take a look at. There are a lot more things that I want to talk about, but I think one thing that he might want to consider here is that Korea has gone through Asian financial crisis in 1997, and they have fared very well. And as a result of that, when they are hit with the 2008 financial crisis, they did very well. And I was visiting in 2008. My friend was working at the in the government, and he said, we're working until midnight, but this is a lot easier than back in 1997. So the sense that I got was that the experience that they had in 1997 really helped them in 2008, and I think that know-how is still there. And second thing is the 1997 crisis did something that was unthinkable, which was that the Korean bureaucrats, the government workers, are the premier in Korean economy. They were the top. When they were hit with 1997 crisis, their pride was broken. And I think that's when I think the transition from government-led to private sector is really not in a physical sense, but in a psychic sense that occurred. Going to Troy's paper, because we don't have much time, I think, I'm actually a patent practitioner. I have testified or submitted reports in where patent infringement cases come to. So, his innovation idea and this ideas of patents really are important. But I think one thing that you really have to look at is that even though Korea may have all these patents, they might not be that valuable. Not because they're not good patents or good technology, but the way they are written or way the claims are written. So that Korea is a newcomer in this industry, and they don't have the know-how to make the right claims. So think about the lawsuit between Apple and Samsung. How many patents does Samsung have? They have 10,000, I think. They hold the highest number of patents. But what kind of claims have they made against Apple? Very few. Maybe 2 or 3 patents at all. Why is that? Well, there's something that needs to be done about that. It's not just that you develop something, but it's also how do you make it so that you acquire the property rights for those technologies. And that is going to have an important factor. And the second thing that I want to mention here is that it's not just innovation, but it's the branding. Now, I work with a lot of Korean firms where the technology is great, idea is great, but they don't have the marketing power. They don't have the understanding of how the markets work. They're engineers who came up with great ideas, but I see them fail time after time. Great ideas, but they don't last. Why is that? Because they don't have that kind of marketing and other types of support. And I think maybe that's another focus that you might want to think about in innovation. On top of the innovation, that you need some of this other support. And for the remaining time, let me talk a little bit about Claude's paper. 2 minutes. Oh, okay. So he makes a very nice review of what happened in the United States and also in Korea. What I want to ask is, should Korea fully participate in TPP? Because that's one of the your conclusion of the paper is that Korea should be doing that. So then what are the benefits and what are the harms to Korea by participating? Is Korea now joining or want to join because Japan has joined? Why has Japan joined? Is Japan joining because they wanted to go through with Abenomics and they want this was a condition or some kind of trade-off between the United States and Japan? We don't know. But those are some of the things that I have questions about. The dilemma that Korea faces, I think, in trading is that China has become number one trading partner with Korea. And back maybe even 10 years ago, it didn't really matter because a lot of the trade that Korea did ultimately went back to the United States. And so if you actually looked at the indirect trade, the United States was still probably the number one trading partner. It's no longer the case. And so the question then becomes, China now has to balance the United States and China. And again, here's an issue, the dilemma that Korean government is faced with. So what are some of the choices that Koreans have? Well, they could continue with the bilateral free trade agreements, and they have the Japan-Korea, and they have China-Korea free trade agreements that's kind of in the limbo now. You got the regional comprehensive economic partnership headed by China. You got the TPP, and you got the trilateral Korea, Japan, China free trade agreements. He's making me very nervous.
Trying to.
That's why.
But I think the key here is that the Korea's future lies with free trade, and that they should pursue all avenues. Obviously there are costs associated with each one, and obviously things aren't moving as well. But I think from Korea's perspective, that they should be trying everything to create more free trade agreements, more types of free trade environment, and at the same time exploit the free trade agreements they have in place, which others don't have, and try to maximize their benefit from that in the short run. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I've been asked to focus a bit more on Claude, the TPP paper, but I'm going to bring in some of the other papers where relevant. I think they're all great papers. Claude in his paper, one of the key things which gets outlined, I think, is this decline in Korea-US trade and this rise in China-Korean trade. But I think one of the parts to that which comes out a bit in Rick's paper really is sort of the extent that this has really been a reorientating of supply chains, and what we're actually seeing is, factory Asia or the processing trade, where a lot of Korean goods actually are just exported as imports into manufacturing in China, which is ultimately then ending up in the United States. And I think when we think about that orientation of trading relationships in Asia, we can it sheds some light, I think, on the TPP and Korea's thinking around that. Because part of it is also, it demonstrates, that I think the bilateral trade data on Korea-US trade understates now still the significance of the United States for Korea generally, and I think it's true for large developed countries generally, but let's just keep the focus on the United States. And so I'm just going to make 3 points once we sort of start thinking about the trading relationship in that light. So, and this is with regards to the TPP. So, Korea's been pursuing an FTA with China, which, for obvious reasons, it's important that there's a very significant trade and investment relationship there. But I actually think that when we understand China as a step in the process of actually getting goods to the United States, in many respects, actually, another important name for Korea is actually a China-United States FTA that essentially would allow Chinese exports to enter the United States under preferential treatment, because the obvious idea being that increasing the competitiveness of China's exports in the United States market is going to increase demand for Korean inputs, and in fact, a lot of the manufacturing and exporting is actually being undertaken by Korean companies located in China, and this comes out from the FDI, the investment data, which Rick picks up in his paper. So Korea's decision to join the TPP might, in part at least, reflect an analysis by Korea about China's seriousness in joining the TPP. So being part of the TPP would include it in a group of countries which not only, because Korea's essentially got pretty good preferential market access to the United States anyway under its FTA with Korea, but it would build in the dynamic which would give China preferential access, and you certainly want to be part of that agreement that China is part of, because there's going to be rules of origin and the like which are going to be developed in the TPP, which means it's going to make sense to be there, which will pick up a lot of that processing trade which happens through China. Now, the second point I want to make is that another important aspect of the Korean trade relationship is in addition to this processing trade, is the potential for China as an end market in and of itself, and this is happening. And if the reforms that have been announced at the third plenum, where there's an attempt to move China to a more consumer-driven society, actually bear fruit, I think we'll see this to be increasingly true. So the cars and the phones that Korea sells to the United States, it can increasingly hope to sell to China. And this, in a sense, I think Rick picks out a bit in his paper, which is that if manufacturing is going to be such a large share of your economy, and Korea essentially exports its surplus, there's only so much room for growth in the developed world now, and so the next big market which Korea needs really is for China to succeed, and so. This then gets the question of what's Korea's best opportunity in terms of securing better market access into China? Is it through a bilateral route, or is it through essentially the TPP? And again, this assumes that China will eventually join the TPP. And I think that, at least when you think about hedging risk, that Korea is probably going to be better off. China is going to put it this way, China's going to do more in terms of market opening and liberalisation in the context of the TPP than it will in a bilateral context with Korea, simply because the United States will push China in a way that Korea can't push China. So you certainly want to have a parallel bilateral process with China, but I think the gains potentially for Korea in terms of bilateral market access into China are greater in the context of the TPP. And so this, I think, sheds another light on why Korea might want to be part of the TPP. And I think a third reason, which I think also sheds some light on Korea's decision to join the TPP, and I think this is significant, is the role of trade agreements generally as drivers of internal reform and liberalisation. And in fact, from my perspective, in many respects, most of the gains from being a part of a trade agreement come from the driver that it has on domestic reform efforts. And this, in a sense, links, I think, Claude's paper with both Troy's and Rick's paper, which highlight the challenges and the need for reform in Korea and the opportunities that the TPP provides to drive some of those reforms in Korea. So, Rick's talked about the productivity dimension to the Korean economy and how there's a real need to improve that. And Troy's talked about the creative economy. And in fact, if this fusion of creativity and ICT is where Korea's heading, and we're going to get more of Gangnam Style going forward, because I think it's been a great services export in so many different ways. So, I mean, we've got a lot to look forward to, I think, on that front. But I want to talk a little bit specifically about the services dimension, because I think Rick picks this up, and I absolutely agree with it. And it's an interesting challenge, not only in Korea, but I think across a lot of these North Asian economies now. It's true of Taiwan, it's true of Japan as well, which is this highly competitive and efficient sort of export-orientated sector, and this very underperforming, low productivity services sector, which tend to be dominated by small and medium-sized enterprises. And in that respect, if that is really where Korea needs to focus, then I think joining the TPP starts also to make a lot of sense. Reforming the services sector is going to be important for Korea, not only in and of itself, in that services is a growing proportion of a developed economy, which is what you see happening in all developed economies, a large driver of employment, but it's also obviously an input into a whole range of other manufacturing parts of the economy. So it's really an economy-wide issue. And this is going to require issues surrounding education, management, access to even other services inputs, whether we're talking about financial services, consulting, cloud computing. It's going to require the type of innovation that Troy talks about. And many of these reforms can be, in a sense, underpinned by the TPP. Now, you might sort of say, well, Korea already has an FTA with the United States. What's new? But in some respects, there is some new stuff, right? The TPP is going to go further than its bilateral FTA with the United States. It's going to go deeper, and it's going to address a couple of new areas which are really going to be significant, I think, for Korea. Just to name a couple of them, state-owned enterprises is going to be part of the TPP. We don't know exactly what it is, but this may challenge part of the chaebol dynamics in Korea. It's not clear how they're going to define out what is a state-owned enterprise, but some of this may get caught up in these disciplines. And so to the extent that you need to reform that part of the economy, then that part of the TPP may help achieve that goal. Another area, there are a couple of other areas which are going to be new and which are going to be important. One is data flows, cross-border data flows. There's a provision in the Korea FTA on that, but it's fairly light in terms of its bindingness. It's really a first step in trying to develop some trade rules around this new area. Certainly a key part of the 21st century innovation economy. It's about how businesses move data internally, so it's globally, the ability to access cloud computing and other types of services that are provided online and on the internet. If you want to have a dynamic services sector, the ability to not only use online services and the internet for collaboration, R&D and the like, but also the ability to serve services online is key. For the sake of time and opportunity for Q&A, I'll leave it at that, but I think that's my three main comments about thinking about the TPP in Korea.
Okay, do any of the panelists want to respond to some of the discussants' remarks?
Yeah.
Richard?
Okay, few things. In response to Richard Shin about, I define total factor productivity as technology. That was for the sake of time. But it's all the things that make you more productive, one of which is education. And this is the tragedy one of the tragedies of Korea. 70% of Korean high school kids go on to college. High school graduates go on to college. It's more than any other country in the OECD. And yet, what kind of jobs do they get? There are not enough good jobs for these college kids. So if you win the lottery and you get a good job and a good chaebol, hey, baby, you're made. But most of them don't. So in fact, if you add up the lifetime earnings of the average college graduate, and the fact that they've delayed earnings for 4 years, and they paid all this tuition, and they've done the private school ahead of time, they're worse off. But the average expectation is worse off than if they never went to college in the first place. This is a complete waste of talent. It's a tragedy for those families who spent all this time and effort, and these kids who graduate from college. Shouldn't say kids, it really makes me sound old. And it's a tragedy for Korea as a country. Absolutely, this is what we've got to focus on. Now, trade is the driver of reform. I was on a Korean dairy farm a couple of years ago. Now, this is a guy who had about 5 head of cattle. And the government in Korea and Japan, they both pay their farmers a lot. They both bribe them. Well, we shouldn't use, subsidize. The thing is, Korea gets something in return. So does Japan. What Japan gets is the ruling party gets votes. In Korea, the deal is, okay, we're going to subsidize you, but you're going to improve in return. So the fact is, the government says, we're going to subsidize you, so you guys are going to merge your farms, because 5 head of cattle don't cut it. So this guy now had 75 head of cattle, but there were fewer farmers in the village. There are fewer farming villages. That is, farming is going to shrink, but what remains is going to be better. Abe is now negotiating, Prime Minister Abe of Japan, with the U.S. to try to preserve dairy farmers and beef farmers and these rice, of which there are less than 100,000. Forget about rice; it's a special deal. And he may actually sacrifice winning in automobiles for these 100,000 farmers because they got a lot of votes. Man, that is comparative disadvantage. So trade can drive internal reform, but it doesn't necessarily so. It depends how you use it. And if you look at the way the Koreans negotiated with the Australians versus the Japanese, the Koreans said, yeah, we're opening up 99.5% of our everything except rice. Take it. And the Japanese are trying to hold on to the most inefficient part of their economy. So it can create reform, but not necessarily. On 97, 90, Korea was very, very impressive. Its resilience in the 97 and 2008 crises, but those were in external crises. And the Koreans had the resilience to survive them. What I'm talking about is internal corrosion. Far, far different issue. And finally on TPP, the big enchilada is China. TPP is all about China. What's going to be the rules of the game to determine the economic architecture of the globalization in China and these supply chains? Is it going to be an RCEP, which is really centered on China as the hub? Or is it going to be a TPP, which rules about investment codes, state-owned enterprises, intellectual property rights, all kinds of things become the guiding, and some bad stuff like these investment state dispute resolutions, right? But the point is to rope in China, and that China becomes more and more responsible stakeholder, not only economically, but it begins to tip, hopefully, the hope is that it tips the balance inside China to those who want to be what Zeller called responsible stakeholders. Yeah, we have a stake in world trade, so we don't want to start, seizing islands and blowing up countries because people are going to hate us if we do it. And tip the balance inside China to the more cosmopolitan, more modernizing things. That's the hope. Whether that actually happens or not, I leave to Claude.
Yeah, okay, Claude, that means you're up.
Well, given the assumption we've been making, let's be clear. The
TPP
can crash and burn.
Absolutely. No,
it's at least 50-50.
Totally
So
agree.
let's start that. But I also agree with and this goes back to Korea and to Japan. This tipping business is really key. Having Japan and then now the possibility of Korea really tips the balance in terms of the regional economic structure. And that's really, that's why on the economic side, but also things I've said, beyond that into political and security. The second point, just to go back, I didn't have a lot of time. I've raced over some things in terms of Korea and where things go, and China. I've written before, and I should say more emphatically in this paper, I think Korea should go for all of these. You have a sheet anchor in RCEP. I also think that yes, it would be good for Korea. For reasons I'll come back to go ahead certainly and get China done as much as possible. You won't get as much as somebody said as you'll get at the TPP if China joins. But then I'm a little skeptical. Here's where my skepticism. I cannot see the politics of China coming into the TPP for some years. It's not that I would be in favor of it. I'm not. It's not that, but I can't see that happening for a while. So I think that's another reason I think Korea ought to go forward with the China bilateral. I don't think the trilateral is going to go anywhere anytime soon. But I just am skeptical of the politics, certainly in the United States. And the other thing that I have to point out to my commentators is that all of these, most of us here, and myself included, are focused on the economic. Nobody really talked as much as I was trying to put forward on the strategic and security implications. I think another key for Korea is to tie the economic security back to the economics and make it start right in local politics on the economic side of trade. I think it'll be a lot easier in a very tough time, no matter who is the next president, to persuade the U.S. Congress to supply the resources on the security side if we have a successful TPP. If there is an economic stake, it will tie right back in, I think, in a much better fashion to the all politics is local aspect of trade, and whoever the next president is, and the end of this presidency, to have us continue to pivot and have us succeed.
Troy, did you want to make a
response
or rejoinder or reflux, what do we want to call it?
A reflux?
Reflux. So as you talk about branding, maybe we should rebrand TPP. I completely agree with you on the branding, and I guess there's a couple points to where I hint at it, and you can see at the end of my talk about Steve Jobs being a great marketer and everything. It's one of those things to where I've been thinking about. I haven't come to a good example or how I guess I want to put forward. What I mean by that is that, if you look at brands like Samsung and LG and Hyundai, they built themselves over time, but part of building that brand was building it in terms of quality. Hyundai eventually put forward the 10-year, 100,000-mile warranty. I remember I had replaced a TV back around like 2000, 2001 because my old TV died. And, I was in the store and, like Samsung, like, sounds vaguely familiar, is it really good? Now I don't think anybody would question buying a Samsung product. So, there's one way, but that's the long, hard way of sort of establishing a brand. The way that Korea needs to go, and I think maybe with something like, some of the K-pop industry, you see some of this, is more the Steve Jobs way in the sense of that, if you look at smartphones and everything, literally the first smartphone goes back to the late 90s. It didn't have internet, obviously, but it was an IBM phone, I think it's called the Simon, to where they merged a phone and a PDA. Over time, we've had more and more features added on. You had obviously the email and data stuff with BlackBerry where we get Crackberry. In time, Samsung actually was the first company to introduce an MP3 player into a cell phone. Clearly, there's a marketing issue there because I don't think most people probably realize that. So the question is, the iPhone wasn't the first phone with email, internet, and pictures and stuff. Steve Jobs really found a way to take and essentially create a market for this new type of product. And so I agree. Some Korean researcher could come up with the greatest idea and be doing it right now. But if you can't figure out a way to take and essentially create the market and convince people that this is something, not just they should buy, but that they need to buy. Essentially now people believe they need to have a smartphone.
I know.
Okay. Right. Most people.
I've just been told I have to give up my BlackBerry in the morning.
People at a certain age.
That's right.
But, so part of the innovation is more than simply the research. It's the marketing. It's the business side. It's figuring out how to do it on a, this is something else to do that, on a cost-productive manner to where, it's feasible for people to buy it on a commercial basis. If you have a great idea, a great marketing plan, but it's, buy my new car for 4 times as much as everybody else's car, you may not do that well. So, there's other aspects of this, and, really to make this transition, it's going to require Korea to meld them all together. And, the Chaebol, maybe Samsung, if you will, I guess, Kia with, is it, I can't remember, is it Hampshire or Gerbil that they use, is maybe sort of, moved into, the more creative side of, marketing. But, for new companies, they're going to need,
Okay, let's.
So you're saying stop?
Well, we could have used you in the last
Well,
panel.
I have a question here. In the business world, at what point does water seek its own level? It's easy to talk about, well, you got a great product, but Korea lacks the ability to brand in the market. You go to an appliance store, and it's Samsung and LG that lead everything. The Korean automobile manufacturers, or Korean brand, represents about 6 to 7% of all cars that are driven in the United States. Hyundai just came out with a brand new Sonata, and they made it less radical in order to meet the needs and the desires of the people in Korea. But I think one of the big components here that we never really had time to go into, and that is the human factor in both countries. In Korea, people between 15 and 25 years old, there's a 40% employment rate. In the U.S., between 16 and 25, there's a 40% unemployment rate. 40% of college graduates are doing jobs in the U.S. that could be done by people with high school degrees. In Korea, which is known for its engineering students, I read one paper that said only 3% of engineering graduates in Korea actually practice engineering. The rest go in other fields. At the same time, there's a shortage for people to do applied engineering with additional schooling, and people in Korea are desperately looking for more talent in order to fulfill those jobs. Korea, because of its negative birth rate, of the 20 most productive countries in the world, is in the worst position of every single country in terms of the diminishing workforce vis-a-vis the senior citizens coming up on the scene. And Korea has to import workers of 800,000 in order to fulfill jobs. The U.S. has about 15 million people that either don't want to work or are not interested in working or simply cannot work because of lack of training. In both countries, everybody complains about the lack of training in order to do the jobs that presently exist. And if the training were there, and if the employer stepped up to bet themselves as opposed to leaving it to government, and more jobs were filled, everybody would become more productive. I just thought I would throw that in there, just for the heck of it. Who's got the second question out there? Or did you want to respond to that? I mean, Richard, you're the numbers with the whiz and get a steady Becker. But at what point does water seek its own level of the business world, where people automatically fill in the pockets in order to come up with a successful product?
That's a tough one. I mean, like Hyundai, Mr. Shin is over there. I mean, he's going to say it's the 100,000-mile, 7-year or the 10-year warranty. I think that's what broke it. I mean, everyone was going up and up, but Hyundai took it one step further. And same thing with Samsung was originally an OEM building panels for everybody else, but Samsung. But eventually they made their own brand, and the quality paid off. The part that I have problem with all this is that there are big companies like that who could do really well, but there's small companies who are created by engineers. And like I said, the examples that I'm giving are, these guys have great products. I mean, this is something that's definitely, I could see it. But, I'm looking at their business plan, and you know what it says? It says 80% in R&D and product development. And I said, wait a minute, your products are already developed. Right now, you should be spending 80% on marketing and 20% on developing for the future product. And they don't get that. Mm-hmm. And I know it failed. Number of firms like that, I've seen it. And so, there's that level of entrepreneurship that's needed in Korea. Korea has great engineers, but maybe not as many good business folks at this point.
You know what? Forget it. Let's questions.
Okay, questions.
Would any economist or
hang on just a second.
They care to make some speculative remarks on the unification and unified Korea and its economic prospect? David Maxwell talked about how it is going to bring peace and stability, but how about prosperity?
I don't know. If cows had wings, they'd fly. I mean, I'm not sure how the reunification is going to occur. So.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the hardest thing to do that is, under what scenario are you talking about unification? Are you talking
a whole range of it, from the best kind of
right, because I mean, how unification happens will, somewhat impact that prospect. But, in terms of prosperity, I think, this is going to be a transitory process. But in some ways, I know when you talk about this issue, people tend to focus on the economic side. And I actually think, I don't want to undersell this, but I think that's not as significant of an issue going forward for unification as, other issues. I think the political, social, and cultural issues, because I mean, now you're essentially talking about what are largely becoming two separate societies coming together. How do you, someone might argue that the markets or the illegal markets in North Korea are teaching capitalism. But how do you teach, I guess you could say, modern rules-based capitalism to a society that's never had it? How do you integrate into a country that has never had democracy? A rather rough and tumble democracy that you have in South Korea. How will Korea address the issues of when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Communist Party survived and rebranded its name, and people were allowed to run. Will the Korean Workers' Party be banned? Will anybody associated with it, be banned from running? How do you handle these, types of issues? How do you take, one of the things that stuck to me, and this gets back to the economic side, Helmut Kohl was asked once, why did he take and exchange, marks at 1-to-1, and why did he give, East Koreans the same benefits as West Koreans? And his answer, German, sorry. Thank you. But his answer was, and this is kind of always stuck with me, is that I couldn't ask East Germans to be second-class citizens of their own country. And so it's answering these types of issues that I think.
So he condemned them to poverty for a decade.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends on the type of unification. But, if we try what Germans did, I mean, it's going to cost very much, and I think it's not going to work very well. I mean, think about it. We got, almost 27 million North Koreans, and if you want to bring them up to $20,000, per capita GDP equivalent, I don't know. You could do the math. But I don't think that's the right way to look at unification, though. I think the right way to look at unification is that the kind of economic boom it's going to create in Korean Peninsula, that you have a large population that are literate, that could be trained, and that will solve one of the problems that Rick has mentioned about Korean population potentially. So that's one. I think there are lots of other avenues that we can look into in terms of economic development in North Korea that people have not really looked at. It also will open up window for Korea to go into Manchuria, to Mongolia, China, Russia. I mean, this is just there are things that are completely different from East and West Germany that people have not really considered in evaluating the cost and benefit of that reunification.
Okay, so next question. Yes, sir.
I'm Bruce Bechtel of the Center for Jenny Bechtels, and I just wanted to direct two comments to my good friends Troy and Richard Shin. For Troy, I just want you to know I'm living what you were talking about, because I drive a 2013 Kia Sorento, and my wife drives a 2014 Kia Sorento. And for Richard Shin about the Mongolia thing, I really dig their barbecue, man.
Greg.
I have two questions.
Hang on. Let's give the mic to Greg.
Two quick questions. Two quick questions for Troy Stangarone. Troy, you have mentioned venture capital. Now, Korea had a venture capital bonanza in the late 1990s that was birthed by forceps. Unfortunately, the newborn didn't survive.
That's right.
Is Korea in a better position now to pursue that route? If so, how? And the second question is, you have mentioned the Korea Research Fellowship for foreign researchers. How well is Korea doing in terms of having the capacity to retain foreign talent over the long term? This also implying that there are needs on the service industry front, hospitals, schools, Anglophone service professionals, and so on and so forth. If you could comment on that, please.
Okay. Well, I guess in tradition, working backwards. In terms of retaining talent, it's something that Korea's been investing in. This was part of the idea behind New Songdo City, to create this international city where you'd have all these different types of services. It'd be modern, it'd be integrated. But one of the things is, ultimately, I've been to Korea now more times than I can count, and I was there for a certain period for a fellowship and everything. I think Korea is foreigner friendly, but perhaps not in the way of long-term stay, meaning that there are a lot of cultural things, and they talk about you're trying to build these sort of like hubbed areas, be they either research hubs or other things. And so it's talked about that if you want to turn Korea, be it into a financial hub or other things, that you need these sort of internationally expected services and entertainment things. Korea is probably moving in that direction, but it's still got work to do. So in terms of retaining the talent that comes through, or that they're able to recruit to the Korea Research Fellowship, I think you're going to need to look at sort of these other aspects. It's sort of like innovation. It's about more than simply taking and coming up with the idea. Is Korea in a better position now than now than in the late 90s to do venture capitalism? There are a series of ways you can look at this. One, Korea has already gone through some boom and bust cycles, so there's a greater, I think, understanding of how some of this works. But ultimately, the success of venture capitalism will depend on a couple of different things. One is the regulatory, and specifically like the financial regulatory structure, set up appropriately. In other words, do you get the regulatory changes to take and ease mergers and acquisitions? They've taken and they've instituted this new. I didn't mention this earlier, but there's a new startup stock market in Korea that they're doing. So if you can take and essentially, the venture capital is part of an ecosystem, and if you can put in place the other aspects of it in terms of what makes it easier for venture capitalists to take, analyze the firms, analyze their prospects, go in, invest, help them transfer the skills they need. As Richard was saying, maybe you shouldn't be putting 80% into R&D. Make these kinds of suggestions, which they do in the U.S. Nurture the firm to a certain point, and then sell it either by, through an IPO, either in Korea, the United States or elsewhere. Whether they're able to then sell the firm off to another company. If you put in place all these things, and if you then have, one of the things that sort of hung over Korea was, and I'm forgetting the bank's Lone Star. This idea of being able to repatriate your capital and everything. If you can move past these types of issues to where foreign investors and even domestic investors can then move their capital in and out of Korea, I think it can be successful and everything. But it's the challenge, like I said, ultimately is even if Park Geun-hye is 120% behind all of this, the problem is that this isn't going to happen in 2-3 years. I mean, this is really going to be a decade or two transition, and so if there is not the political support to continue these policies, and even if it's just on the regulatory side, the next guy comes in and his regulatory people are, we'll say, less helpful, it will take and at a minimum decrease the impact, if not, reverse it.
Okay, next question.
Actually, could I?
Sure, of course.
Listen, I think it's a more basic problem, and this is one of the ways in which Korea resembles Japan in the most awful way. I mean, it's great to have a new product, but if you can't get it on the store shelves, what good is it? If you have a monopolistic control of markets and distribution by the chaebol, who can tell some distributor...
Try to put potato chips on shelves here in this country, and you have to pay a premium to get on the corner or get on top. I mean, it's no different here.
Yeah, it is different.
Chaebol when it comes to marketing.
You know
things
what?
Like
you know
that.
what? Because you can get money. You get on TV, and actually, there are people who have gotten on shelves and pomegranate drinks and all kinds of stuff. If your competitor says to the store, "If you carry that brand, I'm going to cut you off," the Justice Department and the Fair Trade Commission will go after you.
Look at Yellow Cabs can't pick up people at Dulles. It's Washington Flyer only.
Yeah, I know.
I mean,
you know what?
This isn't just Korea.
No, you could point to specific sectors. That's
Uber is winning.
But true, but the economy as a whole, you can have a new company come in, IBM falls down, and Intel and Microsoft kick its butt. And Microsoft falls down, and you got Facebook, and you got Google. The point is, you have room. Detroit falls down, and Toyota and Nissan come in. And Korea probably opens up the market, and it's Camry is the second best selling import in Korea in 2012, but it was Camrys that were made in Kentucky, right? But where were the Fords coming in? The point is, it's easier to be, if you're going to invest in an entrepreneurial company, but you have to have the opportunity where a newcomer come in and have a chance to replace the entrenched guy. And I'm saying is, if you look at Japan, Korea, and the U.S., it's much more common that if you look at the list of the 20 largest companies today and 20 years ago in any sector, it's a very different list than it was 20 years ago here in Japan and Korea. It's the same companies. So why invest in a venture firm if that venture firm cannot grow because the giants are going to stomp on it?
Here in Northern Virginia, about 3 years ago, there was an organization formed called the Northern Virginia Korean American Dry Cleaners Association. All little guys. I think there were 1,000 of them. And they battled and successfully beat a retailer that would come in, purposely undercut and sell at a loss dry cleaning services. And it was one of the most extraordinary things I have ever seen. It happened before. It speaks a lot about the entrepreneurial spirit of the little guys in Korea. But we are smack out of time here. Richard, go ahead.
Just, actually, I agree about the problems with distribution in Korea. You know, I do a lot of work in competition policy, and one of the things that I have told KFTC is that, you know, you could open up the market all you want, but if the distribution channels are tight and there are no entries in that area, then the impact of that free trade is not going to be felt by the consumer. And the examples are about, you know, for example, Chilean wine in Korea. Chile and Korea has a free trade agreement. It should be dirt cheap now, but the price hasn't come down by much. But that's, the reason is because the distribution channels are all tied up by a few big companies, and this is true with European products. You know, for example, if you look at imported cars, well, you know, there's no reason for them to lower their price. They got a limited number of supply, and you know, that's one, that's market demand and what else. But the other thing is that there's a limited distribution channels available in Korea. I have urged KFTC to really, you know, look into this issue of distribution channels, and that's one of the areas that they need to really concentrate on.
What do they answer you?
Well, I mean, it's a you know, not official level.
We'll get back to you.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
no, I think they are aware of it. It's, the question is, you know, you have to find violation of the existing antitrust laws in Korea.
Well, we want to, yeah, last question or comment? Okay, go ahead. You're up.
Right here.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation, for all the panels. So my name is Jin with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I agree with everything being said, and I'd like to just bring it back to something that we haven't mentioned. That is, Korea has, at this moment in time, has risen up to be one of the very important player in the Asia Pacific, geopolitically and economically. And so I'm from Vietnam and part of the ASEAN group, and I think it's very important for economy that we maintain peace and security in the region. And right now, Korea, more than anybody else, is the pivotal player that can do that, both with One Korea project and also with the economic all the agreements that you form in the region. And I also wanted to suggest that you somehow make peace with Japan and try to work in the TPP so that we can have two major players in the trade, the most important trade policy of the century, because it's very important to us that we reorganize the SOEs, we bring up the SMEs, and we also pay attention to climate change. We also pay attention to labor laws, and that's very important for all the small countries in Asia Pacific to go up. And one thing is that Korea is very wise to come to India and establish the automobile hub in India, so that it in the future will reason as a global automobile industry. That's very, very wise. And I would like to bring in India as a very important market, because it's a democracy. It has a tremendous market with 1.2 billion of potential client customers, and it also is very much has another similar values to us. So I feel that besides working with China and U.S., if Korea can also look into developing more FTAs, BTAs, or whatever with India and with ASEAN, that would be tremendous. So I hope that will be in the agenda for this.
Okay, well, we want to thank all of you for. Some people have been here all day. That's great. Get a sleeping bag. It's a real joy to have you here. Let's thank the three organizations for putting on this great presentation today. We'll thank our 5 panelists here. This is the beginning of some very, very interesting panel, because more questions were raised than issues answered, but that's okay, because that's where you get growth, that's where you learn, and that's where people interact to come up with some solutions. And I just want to thank each of you for outstanding presentations and comments. Let's give them a big round of applause.